At our weekend family dinner, my younger sister said starting tomorrow, my boyfriend and his parents are moving in here. If you have a problem with that, you can move out. I just smiled. But then they panicked, asking, "What the hell did you do?" My name is Maya, and I am 32 years old. Growing up in Cascade Heights meant projecting an image of black excellence and old money privilege to everyone looking from the outside. But inside our historic mansion, emotional coldness permeated every single corner. Our sprawling estate was a fortress of expectations that I could never quite meet. My parents, Yvonne and Calvin, always made it abundantly clear who the golden child of our family was. My younger sister Chloe was 26 years old and a lifestyle vlogger who lived entirely in a fantasy world. She was the one who got the brand new car on her 16th birthday, while I worked 2 jobs to pay for a used sedan. She was the one who got lavish vacations funded by our parents, while I stayed home studying finance and real estate to build my career. That Sunday evening, the dining room table was set with our finest china and heavy crystal glasses. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating. My mother Yvonne sat at the head of the table adjusting her perfectly styled hair and praising Chloe for absolutely nothing. "Oh, Chloe, your latest video about finding true love was just magnificent," Yvonne gushed, her voice dripping with adoration. "You and Preston look so perfect together. You are building such a beautiful brand." My father Calvin nodded vigorously, cutting into his steak. "He is a good man from a good family. The kind of old money background that elevates us all. You did well catching a man like him, Chloe." I sat silently, pushing the food around on my plate. I was the director of a commercial real estate trust. I managed millions of dollars in assets. I had recently closed a massive deal that secured a historic building in downtown Atlanta. But when I tried to mention my promotion earlier that evening, my mother had quickly changed the subject to discuss Chloe and her upcoming anniversary trip. To them, my career was just a boring corporate job. I was the unmarried 32-year-old daughter who supposedly leached off her parents by living in their house. They loved reminding me that I was taking up space. "You know, Maya," my father said, glancing at me with a critical eye, "you really should take some tips from your sister. She knows how to present herself. She understands the importance of networking and social climbing. You spend too much time hidden away in your office looking at spreadsheets. A woman your age needs to prioritize building a family legacy, not reviewing property contracts." I took a slow sip of my water, refusing to let the sting of his words show on my face. This was their favorite game. Elevating Chloe meant stepping directly on my neck. Chloe smiled brightly, twirling her fork. "It is just about knowing your worth, Dad. Some people have it, and some people do not." Speaking of building our family legacy, I actually have a major announcement to make tonight. She stood up from her chair, tapping her spoon against her crystal wine glass to ensure she had everyone completely focused on her. I watched as Chloe smoothed down her designer dress, a dress I knew our parents had paid for. She looked at our parents with a radiant smile before turning her gaze to me. Her eyes held a mixture of triumph and pure malice. "Preston and I have been talking about our future," she announced, her voice echoing in the large dining room. "We are taking the next step. Starting tomorrow morning, Preston is moving into this house." My parents immediately broke into applause. Yvonne clasped her hands over her heart, looking like she might cry tears of joy. Calvin raised his wine glass in a toast to his favorite daughter. "That is wonderful news," my father declared. "A strong man should be close to his future bride. We are thrilled to have him." Chloe held up her hand, signaling that she was not finished. "There is more," she said, her smile widening into something predatory. "Preston comes from a very close-knit family. His parents, Richard and Beatrice, are incredibly important to him. They are traveling down from Connecticut to help us plan the wedding and ensure everything meets their family standards. So starting tomorrow, Richard and Beatrice are moving in here too." The dining room went completely silent for a fraction of a second. Even my parents seemed momentarily surprised by the idea of moving an entire family of white strangers into our home. But their desire to impress Preston and his supposedly wealthy family quickly overrode any logical concerns. "We have plenty of room," Yvonne said, quickly recovering her composure. "We want his parents to feel absolutely at home here in Cascade Heights. It will be a wonderful opportunity to blend our families and show them our hospitality." Chloe nodded, her eyes locking onto mine with laser precision. Yes, we do have room, she said. But Richard and Beatrice need the most comfortable accommodations. They are older and they are used to a certain standard of living. They need the master suite on the second floor with the good natural light and the attached sitting room. My heart beat steady and calm. I knew exactly which room she was talking about. It was my room. I had occupied that master suite for the last 5 years. I looked at my sister, keeping my expression completely neutral. That is my room, I said simply. Chloe reached under the dining table and pulled out a flat folded cardboard box. She tossed it casually across the table. The box slid over the polished wood and bumped against my dinner plate. Then pack, she said, her tone entirely devoid of respect. You are occupying the best room in the house, Maya. You are 32 years old and you are single. You do not need all that space. Beatrice has arthritis and she needs the attached sitting room for her morning tea. You can move your things into the basement bedroom. Or honestly, if you have a problem with that, you can just move out entirely. I looked at the empty cardboard box resting against my half-eaten dinner. The sheer audacity of her demand hung in the air. She was ordering me out of my own bedroom to accommodate the parents of her boyfriend, a man who had not even proposed yet. I turned my gaze to my parents, expecting at least a token protest. Surely asking your eldest daughter to move into a damp basement to house strangers would cross some kind of line. But my mother just sighed and picked up her wine glass, avoiding my direct stare. Chloe is right, Maya, Yvonne said, her voice taking on that familiar condescending tone. You have to think about the bigger picture here. Preston is bringing a lot of value to this family. His parents are esteemed members of their community. We cannot exactly put them in the basement. You are young and capable. A few flights of stairs will not hurt you. You need to make room for the family future. My father chimed in, his voice stern and commanding. Do not be selfish, Maya. We are trying to build a major connection here. Preston is the heir to a massive transportation company. You should be grateful we are letting you stay here rent-free at your age anyway. The least you can do is facilitate your sister capturing a high-value husband. Move your things tonight so the room is pristine for Richard and Beatrice tomorrow morning. I want fresh sheets on that bed and all your clutter out of sight. Chloe leaned across the table, resting her elbows on the fine lace tablecloth. And make sure you take all those creepy African art pieces off the walls, she instructed, gesturing vaguely toward the hallway. Beatrice has very classic tastes. She prefers European antiques and neutral colors. We do not want her feeling uncomfortable or intimidated by your weird modern art collection. I want the room neutralized. My mother nodded in immediate agreement. Good point, Chloe. Maya, box up those paintings too. We need the house looking elegant and refined. We are hosting generational wealth tomorrow. We cannot have the place looking like a bohemian art studio. I looked at the cardboard box again. They were entirely serious. They were stripping me of my personal space, my comfort and my dignity to appease people they had never even met. They were asking me to erase my existence in the house to make room for Chloe and her illusions. The level of disrespect was staggering, but it was also incredibly validating. It confirmed every single decision I had made over the past month. It confirmed that I owed these people absolutely no loyalty. I sat back in my chair, letting their words wash over me. Rent-free. That phrase echoed in my mind. For 5 years, I had listened to them boast to their country club friends about this historic brownstone. I had listened to them claim it was the crown jewel of their real estate investments. They genuinely believed they held all the power in this room. They genuinely believed they could toss me into a basement to impress a group of white grifters pretending to be old money. They were so blinded by their desperation for status and their obsession with Chloe that they had completely lost touch with reality. I did not cry, I did not scream, I did not throw my wine in her face or demand respect from my parents. Years of corporate negotiations had taught me that emotional reactions only give your opponents power. Instead, I reached out and gently pushed the cardboard box to the side. I picked up my napkin, wiped my mouth, and placed it neatly beside my plate. I looked at my mother, then my father, and finally locked eyes with my sister. My heart was beating with a slow, rhythmic calm that felt absolutely euphoric. The sheer confidence radiating from Chloe was almost funny, knowing what was about to happen. All right, I said, my voice perfectly steady and light. I offered a warm, genuine smile that caused a brief flash of confusion to cross Chloe's face. She had expected a fight. She had wanted a dramatic argument so she could play the victim for our parents. My immediate compliance unsettled her. Just tell them to pack warm clothes, I added smoothly. The mornings can get a bit chilly around here. My father frowned, clearly suspicious of my lack of resistance. See that you have it done by tonight, Maya. No delays. We want everything perfect for tomorrow. Do not embarrass us. I will not embarrass you, Dad, I promise, standing up from the table. I will leave you all to your celebration. I walked away from the dining room, leaving my half-eaten meal behind. I climbed the grand staircase to the master suite and closed the double doors behind me. The room was expansive, beautiful, and filled with everything I had worked so hard to acquire. I walked over to my closet and pulled out my luxury luggage. I did not pack to move to the basement. I packed to leave. I neatly folded my designer clothes, my important documents, and my jewelry into the suitcases. Zipping the bag, I sent a text message to the head of my private security firm. The master plan initiates tomorrow at exactly 8 in the morning. Be completely ready. I slipped out the back stairs into the night air. Let them have their brief victory tonight. The heavy rumble of a diesel engine rattled the antique window panes of the house at exactly 7 in the morning. I had spent the night in the basement guest room after quietly moving my luxury luggage into the trunk of my car under the cover of darkness. I was already awake, fully dressed in a tailored cream-colored power suit, my hair slicked back perfectly, my makeup flawless. I was not going to meet this day looking like a victim. I poured myself a cup of black coffee from the small kitchenette in the basement and listened to the chaos erupting on the floor above me. The sound of heavy boots slamming against the hardwood floors, the high-pitched squeal of my sister Chloe, directing traffic, and the loud, entitled voices of people who believed the world belonged to them echoed through the ceiling. I took my time walking up the basement stairs, allowing the morning scene to unfold completely before I made my presence known. The heavy mahogany double doors of the estate were propped wide open, letting in the humid Atlanta morning air. A massive commercial moving truck was parked illegally across the pristine driveway, tearing up the landscaping my parents paid a fortune to maintain. But my parents were not complaining at all. In fact, they were acting like ecstatic, overly eager servants. I stepped into the grand foyer and stopped dead in my tracks. There, standing in the center of my custom-designed chef kitchen, was Preston. He was wearing pristine white boat shoes and a pastel pink sweater draped over his shoulders, looking like a cheap parody of a country club advertisement. But it was what he was holding that made my calm heart skip a single beat. In his left hand was a crystal wine glass, and in his right hand was my personal silver corkscrew. On the granite island sat an open bottle of Chateau Margaux 2009. It was a $500 bottle of vintage wine I had purchased to celebrate my first multi-million-dollar commercial real estate closing. Preston poured a generous amount of my hard-earned victory into his glass, and actually topped it off with cheap grocery store orange juice from the fridge. "Good morning, future sister-in-law," Preston said, flashing a brilliant white smile that completely lacked any genuine warmth. "I hope you do not mind. Moving is such exhausting work, and I needed a little hair of the dog to get the blood flowing. Your parents told me to make myself completely at home." Before I could even respond to the audacity of a mediocre man, turning my celebratory vintage into a morning mimosa. A loud, abrasive voice echoed from the main hallway. "Oh my God, Richard, look at this absolute monstrosity." I turned to see Beatrice Preston, mother, standing in front of my favorite piece of art. Beatrice was a woman who clearly wore her presumed wealth like a weapon. She dripped in excessive gold jewelry and wore a designer tracksuit that screamed new money, pretending to be old money. She was pointing a perfectly manicured finger at a stunning contemporary painting by an emerging African-American artist, a piece I had commissioned specifically for that wall to celebrate our culture. "What is this tribal nonsense?" Beatrice complained, wrinkling her nose as if the painting emitted a foul odor. "It is so aggressive and dark. It completely ruins the elegant feng shui of the hallway." Richard Preston, father, lumbered up beside her, puffing his chest out. He did not even look at the painting before agreeing with his wife. "You are right, honey," he grunted. It looks like something you would find at a flea market downtown. We cannot have our high society guests seeing this when they come over for dinner parties. Without waiting for permission, Beatrice reached out and physically pulled the heavy canvas off the wall. She did not set it down gently. She practically dropped it onto the polished hardwood floor, letting the expensive custom frame clatter violently against the wood. Then she kicked it casually with the toe of her sneaker, sliding it out of her way like trash. "Chloe, darling," she called out, her voice piercing the air. "We simply must redecorate this space immediately. This aesthetic is far too urban and creepy for our tastes. We need something lighter, something more European and sophisticated." My mother Yvonne rushed into the hallway, wiping her hands on an apron. Instead of defending her own culture or defending the art that belonged to her eldest daughter, my mother actually bowed her head in apology. "Oh, Beatrice, I am so sorry you had to see that." Yvonne simpered, her voice practically dripping with desperation. "Maya has very quirky and unusual taste. She insists on collecting those bizarre pieces. We will have it moved to the basement right now. Please do not let it upset you. We want this house to completely reflect your refined standards." I stood perfectly still, watching my mother sacrifice her dignity for the approval of a white woman she had just met. It was a pathetic display, but it was exactly who my parents were. They had spent their entire lives chasing proximity to whiteness, believing that associating with people like Richard and Beatrice would somehow elevate their own social standing in the city. They were so desperate to secure Preston as a son-in-law that they were willing to let his family trash their heritage, their home, and their own daughter. I watched as Richard's heavy leather loafers stepped carelessly over my decorative books and personal items that Chloe had already tossed out of the master suite onto the floor. They were treating the house like a conquered territory. I stepped fully into the light of the foyer, the heels of my shoes clicking sharply against the floorboards. Chloe looked up from her phone and frowned at me. "I thought I told you to stay out of sight today, Maya," she snapped, treating me like an annoying pest. "We are trying to get Preston parents settled into the master suite, and you standing around glaring at everyone is ruining the vibe. You need to go downstairs and stay there until we are done unpacking." Beatrice turned around and looked me up and down with a condescending sneer. "Oh, you must be the older sister," she said, her tone implying she had just stepped in something unpleasant. "Listen, be a dear and run out to the moving truck. There is a heavy box of imported linens on the edge of the ramp. My back is simply killing me. And since you are just standing there doing absolutely nothing, you might as well make yourself useful." I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I did not snatch the bottle of wine out of Preston's hand or scream at Beatrice to pick up my ruined painting. Years of sitting across the negotiation table from ruthless corporate developers had taught me that whoever loses their temper first loses the war. I simply looked at the vintage grandfather clock standing in the corner of the hall. It was 7:55 in the morning. I had exactly 5 minutes. My father Calvin marched into the hallway, his face flushed with anger when he saw me ignoring Beatrice's command. "Maya, do not be rude to our guests," he barked, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Beatrice asked you to do a simple task. Stop looking at us with that disrespectful attitude. You pack up the rest of your junk and you make yourself useful, or you can pack your bags and leave this house entirely. We will not tolerate your bitterness today." I smiled, a slow, chilling smile that seemed to momentarily confuse my father. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out my phone. I tapped a single contact on my speed dial and put the phone to my ear. The line connected immediately. "This is Maya," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly projected so that everyone in the room could hear me clearly. "Execute the perimeter protocol. Send the tactical team to the front doors right now. Secure all exits. No one else enters the property." I lowered the phone and slid it back into my pocket. For 3 seconds, the room was completely silent. Then Chloe burst into a loud, theatrical fit of high-pitched laughter. "Are you kidding me right now?" she gasped, clutching her stomach. "Did you seriously just pretend to call security?" Preston chuckled loudly, leaning against the kitchen island and taking another sip of my stolen vintage wine. "That is a bit dramatic, do not you think, Maya?" he mocked, shaking his head. "Calling fake bouncers because you are mad you got kicked out of the big bedroom. I guess being a lonely spinster really does make a woman crazy." Beatrice sighed loudly and placed a dramatic hand over her heart, turning to my mother. Yvonne, is she always this emotionally unstable? Beatrice asked loudly, making sure I heard every word. How absolutely exhausting for you, having an adult child throwing imaginary tantrums in your beautiful home. It must be so difficult dealing with someone who clearly has such deep psychological issues. Yvonne looked utterly mortified. She rushed toward me, her eyes blazing with fury. Maya stopped this embarrassing performance immediately, she hissed, grabbing my arm. I smoothly pulled my arm out of her grasp, adjusting my sleeve. You are making a fool of yourself in front of Richard and Beatrice. Yvonne continued, her voice trembling with rage. You are acting like a spoiled, jealous child because your sister is getting married to a wonderful man and you are completely alone. Stop playing these ridiculous games. Calvin stepped forward, puffing his chest out, trying to play the role of the intimidating patriarch. I have had enough of this utter disrespect, he thundered, pointing a finger directly in my face. This is my house. I pay the bills here. I make the rules. You do not call anyone to my property. You have exactly 5 minutes to apologize to Preston and his wonderful parents, or I am personally throwing you out onto the street. I am done dealing with your bitter, miserable energy. I let his threats wash over me like water. I looked at the man who had spent the last 20 years making me feel inadequate, and I felt absolutely nothing but pity. You pay the bills here? I asked, my voice dangerously soft. That is a fascinating story, Dad. You really love telling that story to your country club friends, do not you? You love acting like the absolute king of the castle. Chloe rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. Oh, please. Here comes the tired speech about how much she contributes to the groceries, she whined to Preston. She is just jealous that you are bringing real wealth into this family, Preston. She knows she will never attract a man of your caliber, so she has to try and ruin my happy moment. Richard let out a booming, arrogant laugh from the hallway. Well, little lady, he said, addressing me with dripping condescension. If you want to play security guard, you can go stand at the end of the driveway and watch the rest of our furniture get unloaded. Otherwise, stay out of the way of the adults. We have a wedding to plan and a house to redecorate. This place needs a serious facelift to get the ghetto stench out of it. I stood my ground, perfectly poised, soaking in every insult, every microaggression, every bold-faced lie. My family hurled at me to protect these invaders. They felt so incredibly powerful in that moment. They genuinely believed they had stripped me of my dignity and put me in my place. They thought I was a pathetic, heartbroken woman, making empty threats because I had lost my bedroom. I checked my watch one last time. It was exactly 8 in the morning, right on cue. The heavy, rhythmic sound of synchronized tactical boots echoed from the front porch. The heavy footsteps were deliberate and unignorable, shaking the wooden floorboards beneath our feet. The laughter in the room abruptly died. 4 massive men dressed in sharp black tactical uniforms stepped through the open double doors of the grand foyer. They moved with a terrifying, coordinated precision that immediately sucked all the oxygen out of the room. The lead officer, a towering man with broad shoulders and a stern expression, stepped directly past Richard without even acknowledging his existence. The heavy equipment belts around their waists creaked slightly in the dead silence of the house. They fanned out smoothly. 2 officers took positions flanking the heavy front doors, physically blocking the only main exit, while the third moved to secure the hallway leading toward the back patio. The captain stopped exactly 3 feet behind me, folding his hands behind his back and standing at strict attention. The physical shift in the room was instantaneous and absolute. The smug superiority that had been radiating from my parents and Preston family vanished, completely replaced by genuine shock and rising panic. Beatrice actually dropped the small decorative vase she had been holding, letting it shatter into dozens of pieces against the hardwood floor. She let out a high-pitched shriek and scrambled backward, hiding behind her husband. Richard puffed out his chest, trying to mask his sudden fear with bluster, but I could see his hands shaking slightly. He looked at the armed men, and then looked at my father, expecting him to do something. Calvin's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk collar. He could not comprehend what was happening in his perfect, carefully curated world. What is the meaning of this? Calvin roared, his voice cracking slightly at the end. "Who are you people, and how dare you barge into my private residence? Get out of my house right now before I have you all arrested for trespassing." The captain did not even blink. He looked straight ahead, completely ignoring my father's furious demands. He addressed only me, his voice a deep, calm baritone that cut through the panic. "The perimeter is fully secured. Ms. Maya, the captain, reported, maintaining perfect professional detachment. All access points are locked down. We await your further instructions." My mother, Yvonne, let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest, as if she might actually faint. She looked at me with wild, terrified eyes, unable to process that these imposing men were taking orders directly from the daughter she had just been treating like a worthless servant. "Maya, what have you done?" Yvonne shrieked, her voice trembling with hysteria. "Have you completely lost your mind? You hired armed thugs to intimidate your own family and our distinguished guests. I am calling the police right this second. You are going straight to jail for this psychotic behavior." Chloe practically lunged across the kitchen island, grabbing Preston's arm and hiding behind his pastel pink sweater. She looked absolutely terrified, but true to her nature, she immediately tried to play the victim. "Preston, do something," she whined, tugging at his sleeve. "She is crazy. She is trying to hurt us because she is jealous of our wedding. Make them leave." Preston, however, did not look like the confident, arrogant man who had been sipping my vintage wine just minutes ago. He looked pale and distinctly uncomfortable. He set the wine glass down on the counter very carefully, stepping back from the security team. He was a coward who liked to bully people with words, but crumbled the moment he faced actual physical authority. Calvin pulled his cell phone from his pocket, his fingers jabbing aggressively at the screen. "I am dialing 911, he threatened, glaring at me with absolute hatred. "I warned you, Maya. I told you to stop playing games, and now you have crossed a line you can never uncross. You are going to leave this house in handcuffs, and you are never coming back." I did not move a single inch. I just smiled at him, a calm, pleasant smile that seemed to infuriate him even more. "Do it, Dad," I said, my voice soft and encouraging. "Call the police. In fact, put them on speakerphone so we can all hear. Tell the dispatcher that you have unauthorized intruders in the house. Tell them you want everyone who does not belong here removed immediately. I highly encourage it." My father hesitated, his thumb hovering over the call button. My lack of fear confused him. He was so used to me backing down, so used to me swallowing my pride to keep the peace, that my absolute defiance short-circuited his brain. He looked at the heavily armed security guards, and then back at me, uncertainty finally breaking through his arrogant facade. Beatrice stepped forward, her face twisted with aristocratic outrage. "Calvin, call the authorities immediately," she demanded, her voice shrill and grating. "This is completely unacceptable. We are respectable people, and we will not be subjected to this kind of thuggish intimidation. If you do not call the police, Richard and I will be leaving, taking Preston with us, and this wedding will be entirely cancelled. I will not have my son marrying into a family of dangerous lunatics." The threat of losing the wealthy white in-laws was the ultimate trigger for my mother. She practically threw herself across the room toward my father. "Calvin, do something," she sobbed hysterically. "She is ruining everything. Maya is ruining our entire future. Make these men leave right now. Tell them you are the owner of this property and they are trespassing." I slowly walked over to the kitchen island, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. The sound drew every eye in the room back to me. I stopped right next to where Preston had set down my wine glass. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. I held it up for a moment, letting them all stare at it before I dropped it onto the pristine granite countertop. The heavy thud echoed through the silent kitchen. "Owner of this property?" I asked, repeating my mother's words with a light musical laugh. "That is very interesting choice of words, Mom. It really is." I looked directly at my father, who was still holding his phone in a frozen grip. "You pay the bills here, Dad?" I asked, repeating his earlier boast. "You are the king of the castle. You make the rules because this is your grand historic estate. Is that what you told Richard and Beatrice? Did you tell them about your massive real estate portfolio and your generational wealth?" Calvin's jaw tightened, his eyes darting to Richard and then back to me. "Shut your mouth, Maya," he hissed under his breath, trying to keep his voice low enough that the others would not hear the panic creeping in. "Do not say another word. You do not know what you are talking about. Oh, but I do, I countered, my voice ringing out clear and strong. I know exactly what I'm talking about. And since you all wanted to treat me like a piece of garbage to be tossed into the basement, I think it is time we had a little family meeting about the actual history of this beautiful house. I rested my hands on the granite island, leaning forward slightly. Let us take a quick trip down memory lane, I announced, addressing the entire room. 5 years ago, my brilliant little sister Chloe decided she wanted to be an entrepreneur. She wanted to open a luxury wellness spa in the most expensive district in Atlanta. She had absolutely no business experience, no business plan, and no real skills. But she cried and begged and told our parents it was her ultimate dream. So what did our loving parents do? Yvonne let out a strangled cry, reaching out as if she could physically stop the words from leaving my mouth. Maya, please stop, she begged, her voice cracking. Do not do this in front of them. I ignored her completely. Our parents took out a massive second mortgage on this beautiful historic home. I continued, gesturing around the grand kitchen. They leveraged every single bit of equity they had built up over 30 years just to fund Chloe's doomed vanity project. And exactly as anyone with a brain could have predicted, the luxury spa went completely bankrupt in less than 8 months. Chloe spent all the money on lavish parties and custom furniture, and the business collapsed, leaving our parents drowning in debt. Chloe's face turned a mottled shade of red and white. She shrank back against the cabinets, looking frantically at Preston, who was now staring at her with narrowed, calculating eyes. The illusion of her being a wealthy, successful influencer was rapidly disintegrating. They could not make the payments, I said, my voice dropping to a serious, clinical tone. They defaulted on the loans. The bank sent notice after notice. And eventually the inevitable happened. The bank foreclosed on this magnificent property. They seized the house. You lost it, Dad. You lost the family legacy because you could not say no to your spoiled youngest daughter. Calvin looked like he had been physically struck. He staggered backward slightly, leaning against the wall for support. His chest heaved as he struggled to breathe, the shame of his deepest, darkest secret being exposed in front of the people he worshipped, breaking him completely. But you still live here, Richard pointed out, his voice suddenly sharp and suspicious. He was a grifter himself, so he immediately recognized the scent of financial ruin. If the bank foreclosed 5 years ago, how are you still standing in this kitchen? That is the best part of the story, I said, offering Richard a cold smile. A few weeks before the final eviction notice was served, a private corporate investment fund swooped in and bought the property directly from the bank at auction. The new owners were incredibly generous. They offered my parents a quiet, confidential lease agreement. They allowed them to stay in the house as renters, paying a fraction of the market rate so they could save face. My parents got to keep pretending they were wealthy homeowners to all their country club friends, and in exchange, they just had to pay their monthly rent on time. Beatrice gasped, clutching her expensive jewelry. Renters, she squeaked, looking at my mother as if she had just grown 2 heads. You are renting this house. You told us you owned it outright. You told us it had been in your family for generations. You lied to us. Yvonne burst into tears, burying her face in her hands. The humiliation of being exposed as a fraud to her wealthy white idols was literally destroying her. But the story is not over yet, I said, bringing their attention back to the thick manila folder on the counter. You see, my parents never bothered to look into the corporate structure of the investment fund that bought their house. They were so relieved to be saved from public embarrassment that they just signed the lease agreement and went back to playing their little pretend games of high society. I reached out and flipped the folder open, revealing a stack of official legal documents stamped with state seals and notary signatures. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the top document. The fund is called Apex Holdings LLC. I explained, my voice perfectly calm and measured. It is a commercial real estate trust that specializes in acquiring distressed premium properties. It is a very successful fund, and I am the sole owner, the sole managing director, and the sole shareholder of that fund. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed down on every single person in the room. Even the security guards seemed to stand a little straighter. Chloe's mouth fell open in a comical expression of pure, dumbfounded shock. She stared at the documents and then stared at me, her brain completely unable to process the words I had just spoken. You, Calvin whispered, his voice barely a raspy breath. No, that is impossible. You do not have that kind of money. You are just a mid-level manager. I smiled, the satisfaction of this moment sweeter than anything I had ever tasted. I am the director of the fund, Dad, I corrected him gently. I used the commission from my first major commercial deal to establish the holding company. I bought this house at auction for pennies on the dollar because the bank just wanted the bad debt off their books. I bought it because despite how terribly you treated me, I did not want to see you out on the street. I have been your landlord for 5 years. I own every brick, every floorboard, and every single blade of grass on this property. I picked up the lease agreement and held it up for him to see. And according to Section 4, Paragraph B of your lease agreement, any unauthorized long-term guests or subletting attempts are a direct violation of the terms of occupancy. You do not have the right to move Preston into this house. You certainly do not have the right to move Richard and Beatrice into this house. And you absolutely do not have the right to demand that I, the legal owner of this entire estate, move into a damp basement to accommodate your unauthorized guests. I tossed the lease agreement back onto the pile and looked at Beatrice, whose face had frozen in a mask of absolute horror. So I continued, my voice ringing with total authority. When I say that my security team is going to block the doors, I mean exactly that. No one is moving any furniture into my house today. The only thing happening today is a serious conversation about who is getting evicted. The silence that followed my declaration was so absolute that I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background. My mother Yvonne stood frozen in the center of the kitchen, her mouth slightly open, her eyes darting frantically between me and the heavy legal documents resting on the granite island. The reality of her situation was crashing down around her, but instead of showing a single ounce of remorse or humility, her mind immediately began working to construct a new alternative reality. I watched the exact moment her survival instincts kicked in. She straightened her posture, smoothed her hands over her apron, and took a step toward me. Her face contorted into a mask of wounded maternal disappointment. Maya, how could you do something so deceitful? Yvonne asked, her voice trembling with a perfectly manufactured sense of betrayal. You bought this house 5 years ago and you kept it a secret from your own flesh and blood. We have been paying you rent every single month thinking we were paying a faceless corporation. You let us struggle and stress over those payments when you had the power to simply give us the deed. I stared at her, completely fascinated by her sheer audacity. I did not deceive you, Mom, I replied, my voice calm and even. I saved you. The bank was fully prepared to throw you and your belongings out onto the street. You were 30 days away from public ruin. I used my own money to purchase this property so you could maintain your precious social standing. The rent you paid barely covered the property taxes and the maintenance costs. I subsidized your lifestyle for half a decade. Yvonne shook her head violently, rejecting my logic. If you really cared about this family, you would have paid off the debt and put the house back in our names, she argued, stepping closer. You kept it in a trust because you wanted to hold this over our heads. You wanted to feel superior. And now you are using it to embarrass us in front of Richard and Beatrice. She turned slightly, gesturing toward Preston's parents, who were still standing near the hallway, looking equal parts shocked and irritated. Maya, please, Yvonne pleaded, dropping her voice to a harsh, desperate whisper meant only for me. You are making us look like absolute fools. We are supposed to be a proud, successful family. You are confirming every terrible stereotype about our people, fighting over property and acting unruly. Do not do this in front of them. Save whatever grievances you have for later, but right now I need you to play along. Tell your little security team to leave. Let Richard and Beatrice have the master bedroom. We can sort out the ownership details after the wedding. Do not ruin your sister's future just because you are holding on to some petty grudge. I felt a cold laugh rising in my chest. A petty grudge, I repeated. 10 minutes ago, you told me to pack my bags and move into a damp basement to accommodate complete strangers. 10 minutes ago, you told me I was a lonely spinster taking up space in your house. You were perfectly willing to strip me of my dignity and throw me out onto the street to impress these people. But now that you realize I hold the keys, you want to invoke family loyalty. You want to talk about protecting our image. My father Calvin finally found his voice. He pushed past my mother, his face dark with unresolved anger. He was a man who had built his entire identity on being the patriarch, the provider, the undisputed authority figure. The revelation that he had been living under my roof, renting his life from his unappreciated middle daughter, was a blow his ego simply could not process. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "I do not care whose name is on that piece of paper," Calvin growled, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "I am your father. I raised you. I put clothes on your back and food in your mouth. You owe me respect. You do not get to stand in this kitchen and dictate terms to me. I am still the head of this family, and I am telling you to call off these goons right now. We are moving Preston and his family in today, and that is final." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at the finger pointing in my face, and then looked directly into my father's eyes. "You stopped being the head of this family the day you secretly mortgaged our future to fund a luxury spa that everyone knew would fail," I said coldly. "You gambled away the only real asset you ever built, and you lost. You demand respect, but you have done absolutely nothing to earn it. This is my property, Calvin. And as of this exact moment, your lease is officially under review." Chloe let out a loud, dramatic wail. She collapsed against the kitchen counter, burying her face in her hands. "You are a monster, Maya," she sobbed, her voice muffled, but loud enough to ensure everyone was paying attention to her. "You planned this whole thing just to destroy my happiness. You could not stand seeing me find a wonderful, wealthy man like Preston. You could not stand that his family accepted me. So you waited until the most important day of my life to pull this evil stunt. You are trying to sabotage my wedding because nobody will ever love you." She lifted her head, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. "Look at what you are doing to Mom and Dad," she cried, pointing an accusing finger at me. "You are giving them heart attacks. You are the most toxic, selfish person I have ever met. Preston, please tell her she cannot do this. Tell her she cannot treat us this way." The room shifted its attention to Preston. Up until this point, he had remained relatively quiet, absorbing the chaos around him. He had watched my parents crumble. He had watched the power dynamic in the room completely flip. I expected him to grab his mother's arm and storm out of the house, declaring that my family was too much drama for his refined old money tastes. I expected him to run. Instead, a slow, creeping smile spread across Preston's face. It was not the charming, dimpled smile he used when he was trying to impress my mother. It was a cold, calculated smirk that completely altered his handsome features. He straightened his posture, brushing a piece of invisible lint off his pastel sweater. He calmly walked past a weeping Chloe and stopped right in front of me. He looked at the armed security guards standing at the doors and let out a soft, dismissive chuckle. "Well played, Maya Preston," said his voice smooth and dripping with condescension. "I have to admit, I did not see that plot twist coming. You really had us all fooled, playing the quiet, obedient daughter while secretly holding the deed to the castle. It is a brilliant power move, truly." He reached into his expensive designer messenger bag resting on the counter. "But here is the thing about power moves," he continued, unzipping a side compartment. "You have to make sure you actually know the rules of the game before you start flipping the board." Preston pulled out a thick stack of mail held together by a rubber band. He removed the rubber band and fanned the envelopes out across the granite countertop, right next to my foreclosure documents. I glanced down at them. They were official bank statements, credit card bills, and a welcome packet from a local utility company. Every single one of them was addressed to Preston at my exact home address. The postmarks showed they had been arriving here for the past 2 weeks. "You see," Maya Preston explained, leaning casually against the island, "I am not just your sister boyfriend dropping by for a weekend visit. I am a legal resident of this property." My eyes narrowed as I stared at the envelopes. "Yvonne, what is this?" I demanded, looking at my mother. "Why is he receiving bank statements at my house?" Yvonne looked away, wringing her hands nervously. "Chloe said Preston needed a local address to set up some wedding vendor accounts," she mumbled. "He forwarded his mail here a few weeks ago. I did not think it was a big deal. We were planning on him moving in anyway." "It is a very big deal," Preston corrected her, his smirk growing wider. He tapped a finger against the utility welcome packet. "You see, in this beautiful state, establishing residency is actually quite simple. I changed my permanent mailing address to this location 14 days ago. Furthermore, Chloe and I moved several large boxes of my personal belongings into the basement storage area last week. I have a key to the front door which your lovely mother provided. And as of last night, my parents also forwarded their primary mailing addresses here to prepare for their extended stay. I looked at Preston, analyzing the sudden shift in his demeanor. The panic he had shown when the security guards first walked in was gone. He was no longer the frightened fiancé. He was speaking with the practiced rhythmic cadence of a man who intimately understood the loopholes of the legal system. He knew exactly what he was doing. "You can wave your deed in the air all you want," Maya Preston said, crossing his arms over his chest. "You can bring in all the private security guards you can afford. But the law is the law. We have established legal tenancy at this address. We are not trespassers. We are squatters with established rights. If your guards lay a single finger on my parents or attempt to remove our property from that moving truck, I will call the police myself." He leaned in closer, lowering his voice so that only I could hear the absolute malice in his tone. "And when the police arrive, I will show them this mail. I will show them my key. And the officers will tell your very expensive tactical team that this is a civil dispute. They will tell you that you cannot execute a self-help eviction. If you want us out of this house, you are going to have to take us to court. You are going to have to file a formal eviction notice, wait for a hearing, and fight us in front of a judge. That process takes at least 6 months, usually longer when the courts are backed up." Richard, who had been cowering near the hallway, suddenly seemed to regain his courage. He puffed out his chest again and let out a loud, booming laugh. "That is right, son," he cheered, stepping forward to clap Preston on the shoulder. "You tell her. We know our rights. You cannot just throw people out on the street without due process. We are legal residents now." Beatrice immediately recovered her haughty attitude. She smoothed down her tracksuit and shot me a look of pure venomous triumph. "Well, I suppose that settles it," she declared loudly. "You tried your little intimidation tactic and it failed miserably. Now, if you do not mind, I have had a very stressful morning and I need to lie down. Chloe, darling, please have someone bring my bags up to the master suite. And Maya, be a dear and make sure your weird art is cleared out of the hallway before I come back down for lunch." I stood in the center of my kitchen, surrounded by a family that had betrayed me and a group of strangers who were actively hijacking my home. The security captain shifted his weight slightly, catching my eye. He was waiting for my command. He knew exactly what Preston had just said was legally accurate. If my guards physically threw them out, Preston could sue my corporate fund for an illegal eviction. He could drag my holding company into a messy public lawsuit and claim emotional distress. It was a classic grifter tactic. They find a host they latch on, and they use the slow grinding wheels of the legal system to bleed the host dry. My parents looked visibly relieved. They did not care that Preston had just admitted to manipulating the legal system to squat in a house he did not own. They only cared that his technicality allowed them to save face. They looked at Preston with renewed admiration, viewing his deceptive legal maneuvering as proof of his brilliant business acumen. "See, Maya," my father said, a smug tone returning to his voice. "You thought you had it all figured out, but Preston is a smart man. You cannot just bully your way through life. Now call off your guards and go pack your things like you were told. You have caused enough trouble for one day." I looked at Preston. I looked at the fake confidence radiating from his posture. He really thought he had backed me into a corner. He thought because he knew a few legal loopholes about tenancy rights, that he was the smartest person in the room. He believed that because I was a woman who had just been betrayed by her family, I would eventually break down, cry, and surrender my space to avoid a lengthy court battle. He thought he was dealing with an amateur. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It started at the corners of my mouth and reached all the way to my eyes. The sheer, unadulterated joy of the challenge washed over me, completely neutralizing the anger and the betrayal I had felt just moments before. I let out a soft, melodic laugh that made Preston's smirk falter for just a fraction of a second. "You know, Preston," I said, my voice cheerful and bright, "I have to apologize. I completely misjudged you. When you first walked in here wearing that ridiculous sweater, I thought you were just a spoiled trust fund kid looking for a free ride. But you are not, are you?" I walked around the island, slowly circling him. Old money does not know the exact legal time frame for a civil eviction process in the state of Georgia. I noted, tapping my chin thoughtfully. Wealthy heirs do not preemptively change their mailing addresses to properties they do not own just to establish squatter rights. That is the behavior of a professional parasite. That is the behavior of someone who has done this before. Preston's jaw tightened. His eyes darkened and the charming facade cracked, revealing the cold, calculating predator beneath. "Call it whatever you want, Maya," he muttered, his voice low and hostile. "The law is on my side. We are staying. Get used to it, landlord." I stopped circling and stood directly in front of him. "You are absolutely right," I agreed, nodding my head. "You have established residency. You have the mail. You have the key. If I force you out today, it is an illegal eviction. You played your hand perfectly." I turned to the security captain, who was still standing at attention. "Captain," I said, my voice ringing with authority. "Stand down. The intruders have established legal tenancy. They are permitted to remain on the premises. However, you will maintain the exterior perimeter. Nobody else enters this property without my direct authorization." The captain nodded sharply. "Understood, ma'am." Chloe let out a loud, victorious cheer. She threw her arms around Preston's neck, burying her face in his shoulder. "You did it, baby," she squealed. "You put her right in her place. I knew you would protect us." My mother let out a massive sigh of relief, sinking onto one of the bar stools. "Oh, thank goodness," she breathed. "Now we can finally get back to normal. Maya, please just go downstairs. Let us have some peace." I picked up my manila folder and tucked it neatly back into my leather briefcase. I looked at the group of people celebrating their perceived victory in my kitchen. They were so busy popping champagne over winning a battle that they did not realize they had just trapped themselves inside the war zone. "You wanted to play the tenant game?" Preston, I said, walking toward the back staircase that led to the basement. I paused at the doorway, looking back at him over my shoulder. "I accept the terms of engagement. But you should know something about me before you get too comfortable. I do not just own this house. I manage commercial assets for some of the most ruthless corporations in this country. I destroy professional squatters for a living." I smiled at him one last time. "You wanted to be my tenant. Fine. But you just made yourselves my absolute responsibility. Enjoy the master suite while you can." I turned and walked down the stairs, leaving them to their celebration. As I reached the basement, I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for the best private investigator in Atlanta. The game had officially changed, and I was about to dig up every single skeleton Preston and his family had ever buried. The next 14 days were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Preston and his family moved through my historic estate like a plague of locusts, consuming everything in their path while complaining about the taste. They treated the squatter loophole not just as a legal shield, but as a license to completely disregard basic human decency. The house I had painstakingly restored with my own money was rapidly transformed into an absolute nightmare. Richard treated the antique mahogany floors like his personal ashtray. He smoked cheap, pungent cigars indoors, despite my strict policies against it, and he intentionally ground the ashes into the expensive Persian rugs. He walked around the house in an undershirt, loudly barking complaints about the water pressure and the speed of the internet. Beatrice was infinitely worse. She fully leaned into her delusion of being a wealthy matriarch presiding over a grand southern estate. She began hosting elaborate afternoon tea parties in my formal dining room. She invited a rotating cast of middle-aged white women she had somehow befriended at the local country club, where my parents were desperately trying to maintain their membership. Beatrice would parade these women through my home, pointing out the architectural details as if they belonged to her own family lineage. She completely ignored the fact that the property was a historic landmark of Black success in Atlanta. Instead, she referred to it as her son's summer retreat. During these tea parties, Beatrice made it a specific point to treat me like the hired help. Whenever I walked upstairs to grab a bottle of water or a file from my home office, she would snap her fingers at me. She would loudly ask me to clear the empty teacups or fetch more ice for her guests. "Maya, be a dear, and take this trash out to the bins," she would command, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Do not just stand there hovering while we are trying to enjoy our afternoon." My mother Yvonne sat right beside her during these gatherings, sipping tea and nodding along, completely complicit in my humiliation. She would actually look at me with a warning glare, silently demanding that I obey the white woman who was actively stealing my home. She was so terrified that Beatrice might decide we were not high class enough for Preston that she was willing to let me be treated like a maid. I never argued. I never raised my voice. I simply took the dirty plates and the empty glasses and carried them away with a polite nod. I let them believe they had completely broken my spirit. I let them think I was too intimidated by their legal threats to fight back. But I was not acting out of fear. Every time I cleared those tables, I was working. I carefully collected the unwashed crystal glasses that Preston and Richard used. I wore latex gloves hidden inside my pockets and slipped their discarded items into sterile plastic evidence bags the moment I reached the privacy of the kitchen pantry. When Richard left his half-smoked cigars smoldering on the patio railing, I casually swept them into sealed containers. I gathered strands of hair from the bathroom sinks they used. I was quietly, methodically building a biological profile of the men who had invaded my life. I needed undeniable physical proof of their identities before I unleashed the full force of my resources against them. Chloe was living in a state of absolute euphoria. She paraded around the house like a triumphant queen who had just conquered a rival kingdom. The pinnacle of her joy was the engagement ring Preston had finally given her. It was massive. She claimed it was a flawless 3-carat diamond passed down through his aristocratic family for generations. She shoved her left hand into the face of anyone who walked through the front door. She spent hours recording videos for her lifestyle vlog, holding the ring up to the ring light and bragging about how true love and patience lead to the ultimate fairy tale ending. "Look at how it catches the light, Maya." She taunted me one evening as I was making a cup of coffee. She thrust her hand directly over my mug. "Preston says the clarity is absolutely unmatched. It is completely flawless, just like our relationship. I suppose it must be hard for you to see this every day, knowing you will never wear anything this beautiful." I glanced at the ring. My trained eye immediately noticed the slight cloudiness in the center of the stone and the cheap craftsmanship of the platinum setting. It did not look like a generational family heirloom. It looked like a generic piece of jewelry from a strip mall pawn shop. But I kept that observation entirely to myself. "It is very large," I said, simply taking my coffee and walking back down to the basement. Her frustrated sigh echoed down the stairwell, because my lack of jealousy completely deprived her of the drama she craved. My parents were equally insufferable. They tiptoed around Richard and Beatrice, catering to their every absurd demand. My father, Calvin, went out of his way to buy expensive cuts of meat and premium liquors to keep Richard happy. He drained his own bank accounts to stock the massive kitchen pantries with gourmet groceries, just so the invaders would not have to spend a single dime. He was literally paying for the privilege of being disrespected in the home his daughter owned. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain his pride while acting as a servant to a grifter was astonishing to witness. He convinced himself that this was all just a temporary investment in Chloe's glorious future. While they played their pathetic games upstairs, I transformed the basement into a war room. I set up secure encrypted servers and multiple monitors. I organized every piece of evidence, every timeline, and every financial record I could access. The isolation of the basement actually worked in my favor. It gave me the uninterrupted silence I needed to coordinate the destruction of Preston Holdings. 3 days into their occupation, I met with the private investigator I had contacted. His name was Marcus, and he was a former federal agent who specialized in corporate fraud and deep background checks. We met at a discreet coffee shop downtown, far away from the circus at my estate. Marcus was a quiet, observant man who asked very few questions and delivered massive amounts of data. I handed him a thick envelope containing the plastic bags of DNA evidence, the cigar butts, the unwashed glasses, and the hair strands. "I need you to run these through your independent lab contacts," I instructed him, sliding the envelope across the table. "I need to know exactly who these people are, because they are absolutely not the wealthy aristocrats they claim to be. I want full background checks on Richard, Beatrice, and Preston. I want their credit histories, their previous addresses, their civil court records, and any aliases they might have used in the past decade. Leave no stone unturned." Marcus nodded, pocketing the envelope. He pulled out a small notepad. "The name Preston Holdings sounds familiar to me," he murmured, his brow furrowing slightly. I have worked on cases involving similar shell companies. Grifters usually follow a very predictable pattern. They target families with deep insecurities and a desperation for social status. They promise access to elite circles while quietly draining the host resources. Your parents are the perfect marks for this kind of operation. I know, I replied, taking a sip of my dark roast coffee. My parents are blinded by their own superficial ambitions. But these people made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed the house belonged to my parents. They assumed I was just a bitter sibling they could easily push aside. They did not realize they were walking into a property owned by a corporate entity with unlimited resources. I need you to find the kill switch, Marcus. I need the single piece of information that will completely dismantle their entire operation and put them behind bars. Consider it done, Marcus promised. I will put my best analysts on it immediately. Give me a few days to process the physical evidence and dig through the financial registries. If these people have a history of fraud, I will find the paper trail. They always leave a paper trail. I walked back to my car feeling a deep sense of purpose. I was not just enduring the abuse at home, I was actively setting a trap. Every insult Beatrice hurled at me, every fake diamond Chloe flashed in my face, every expensive cigar Richard crushed into my floorboards was just another nail in their collective coffin. I drove back to the estate and parked my car. I walked through the front doors and was immediately greeted by the sound of Preston loudly complaining about the temperature of the house. I smiled politely at him and headed straight down to the basement. I was perfectly content to wait in the dark because I knew the storm I was preparing to unleash would wipe them all off the map. The dossier from Marcus arrived precisely at midnight. A heavily encrypted file dropped into my secure inbox, cutting through the absolute silence of the basement. I opened the document, and the sheer scale of the deception began to unfold across my monitors. The report was meticulously detailed, exposing a reality that was far more sinister than simple squatters looking for a free vacation. Preston Holdings was not a multi-generational transportation empire. It was a completely fabricated corporate shell designed to launder money and hide assets. Marcus had traced the filings back to a small commercial office park in Delaware, a state notorious for corporate secrecy. The company had officially declared bankruptcy in late 2022, leaving behind a massive trail of unpaid vendors, defrauded investors, and pending civil lawsuits. They had bilked over $2 million from small business owners and independent contractors before folding the company and vanishing. The aristocratic background Preston loved to flaunt was an elaborate fiction constructed entirely from stolen identities and carefully curated social media posts. Richard and Beatrice were not wealthy socialites. They were professional grifters. Their real names were not even Richard and Beatrice. They operated under multiple aliases, moving from state to state, finding vulnerable targets and draining them dry. Marcus had uncovered court documents from 3 different states detailing their previous operations. Their method was incredibly consistent and terrifyingly effective. They preyed on families with deep-seated insecurities, specifically targeting marginalized families desperate for social validation or proximity to whiteness. They would infiltrate these families through romantic relationships, charming the most impressionable or spoiled child, usually a daughter. Once they had established a foothold, they would slowly isolate the target family, manipulating them into handing over control of their assets. They were not just squatting in my house. They were actively dismantling my family financial foundation. I scrolled down to the section of the report detailing their current financial status, and my blood ran cold. The grifters were currently facing federal scrutiny for wire fraud, and their personal accounts were frozen. They were absolutely desperate for an immediate infusion of cash to fund their legal defense and maintain their lavish lifestyle. My parents were not just hosting a wedding, they were funding a criminal enterprise. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The sudden rush to move into the house, the fake engagement ring, the aggressive push to redecorate. It was all a calculated effort to extract maximum value from my parents before the wedding even took place. They needed liquid assets and they needed them immediately. I needed to know exactly how far the rot had spread. I opened a separate secure terminal and accessed the primary accounts associated with my parents. While I had officially transferred ownership of the house, I still maintained administrative oversight on several of the accounts I had set up for them during their previous financial crisis. I bypassed the standard security protocols using the backdoor access I had established years ago. What I found made my stomach turn. The accounts were not just depleted, they were completely empty. The emergency savings, the small investment portfolio I had helped them build, even the equity line of credit I had secured for them, it was all gone. The balance on every single account read zero. My heart hammered against my ribs as I dug deeper, searching for the transfer logs. The money had not simply disappeared. It had been systematically funneled into a single external account over the past 48 hours. I traced the routing number, and the destination account belonged to a newly formed LLC registered under Preston name. The scope of the betrayal was staggering, but it was the mechanism of the transfer that truly broke my heart. The bank required explicit authorization for transfers of that magnitude. They needed a signature. They needed consent. I pulled up the digitized authorization forms attached to the transfers and stared at the screen in absolute disbelief. It was a power of attorney. A comprehensive, legally binding document that granted Preston complete, unmitigated control over my parents' entire financial estate. Yvonne and Calvin had willingly signed over every single dime they had left in the world to a man they had known for less than 6 months. They had authorized him to act as their sole financial proxy, empowering him to liquidate their assets, make investment decisions, and access their credit lines. They had handed over their lives to a predator, all because he promised them a wedding that would make their country club friends jealous. They were so blinded by their obsession with status and their desperate need to prove their worth that they had walked willingly into a trap. They believed Preston was investing their money to secure a venue in Tuscany or purchase custom floral arrangements. They believed they were funding a fairy tale. In reality, they were funding a legal defense for a family of career criminals. The money they had scraped together, the retirement they had barely managed to salvage after the spa disaster, it was all being used to pay off Preston outstanding debts and keep his parents out of federal prison. I sat back in my chair, the cool air of the basement chilling the sweat on my forehead. The anger that had been simmering inside me for days suddenly crystallized into something entirely different. It was no longer about a stolen bedroom or a ruined painting. It was about absolute total destruction. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I picked up my phone and dialed a number. I rarely used a direct line to a senior partner at a private equity firm in New York, a man who specialized in acquiring high-risk distressed debt. The phone rang twice before he answered. "Marcus," I said, my voice dropping to a low, urgent whisper. "I need a favor. And I need it executed before the markets open tomorrow morning." "What do you need, Maya?" he asked, his tone immediately shifting to professional attention. "I need you to buy a debt portfolio," I instructed. My eyes locked on the monitor displaying Preston bankruptcy filings. "I am sending you the details now. It is a series of defaulted loans and outstanding civil judgments attached to a shell company called Preston Holdings. The total value is approximately $2.5 million. The current creditors are desperate to offload it. Offer them 20 cents on the dollar. Buy it all. Every single cent." There was a brief pause on the line as Marcus processed the request. "That is a significant acquisition, Maya. Are you sure you want to take on that kind of toxic debt? The recovery rate on those portfolios is usually abysmal." "I am not looking for recovery, Marcus," I said, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. "I am looking for leverage. I want to own every single financial obligation this family has. I want to hold their entire future in my hands. I want to be the only person standing between them and a federal prison cell." "Consider it done," he replied, the sound of keystrokes echoing over the line. "I will have the assignment contracts drafted and executed by sunrise. You will be the sole creditor by the time they wake up." I ended the call and leaned back in my chair, letting the magnitude of the moment wash over me. I had spent my entire life being treated as an afterthought, a disappointment, a secondary character in the grand narrative of my parents' lives. I had watched them sacrifice everything for Chloe, and I had watched them offer my dignity as a peace offering to a family of racist grifters. They wanted to play games with power. They wanted to manipulate the legal system to assert dominance in a house they did not own. They wanted to treat me like collateral damage. I looked at the glowing screens surrounding me, the digital war room that was about to dismantle their entire existence. The trap was set, and the jaws were about to snap shut. I was no longer the quiet, obedient daughter. I was the architect of their absolute ruin, and I was going to enjoy every single second of it. The days leading up to the engagement party were a blur of frantic preparation and obscene spending. Chloe and my mother transformed the expansive backyard of my estate into a scene straight out of a luxury bridal magazine. They hired teams of landscapers to install temporary reflecting pools and massive floral archways dripping with imported white roses. Caterers bustled through my kitchen, barking orders at their staff while setting up carving stations and champagne towers on the pristine stone patio. My father, Calvin, strutted around the grounds treating the hired help with the same dismissive arrogance he usually reserved for me. He was in his element, playing the role of the wealthy patriarch hosting the Atlanta elite. I watched it all from the shadows of my basement war room, completely undisturbed by the hundreds of thousands of dollars they were charging to their credit cards. Every single extravagant purchase was just another link in the heavy chain of debt they were wrapping around their own necks. The evening of the party arrived, bringing with it a suffocating layer of Georgia humidity and a fleet of luxury black cars lining the long driveway. The guest list was a meticulously curated collection of the most influential people in our social circle. There were local politicians, prominent real estate developers, and the wealthiest members of my parents' country club. Everyone who was anyone had been invited to witness the union of the supposedly old money Preston family and the socially ambitious Cascade Heights dynasty. The backyard glowed under the warm light of hundreds of suspended crystal lanterns. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing an elegant soundtrack to the mingling crowd. I walked up the basement stairs and stepped out onto the terrace, blending into the edges of the party. I wore a simple structured emerald green dress, choosing specifically not to compete with the extravagant beaded gown Chloe had purchased for herself. She looked like a heavily frosted cupcake holding court near the massive champagne tower. Preston stood beside her wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that I now knew was purchased using my parents' stolen retirement funds. He smiled handsomely at the guests, effortlessly playing the role of the wealthy heir. Richard and Beatrice were in rare form. They mingled with the elite guests, dropping names of fake European aristocrats and fictional summer homes. Beatrice clutched a glass of expensive champagne, laughing loudly at jokes made by the local city councilman. She wore a necklace of heavy fake diamonds that Marcus, my private investigator, had already confirmed were high-quality cubic zirconia. My mother, Yvonne, trailed behind Beatrice like an obedient shadow, nodding eagerly at every word the white woman spoke. She was so desperate to secure her place in this fabricated high society that she completely ignored the glaring inconsistencies in their stories. I stood near the catering tent, sipping a glass of sparkling water and watching the elaborate performance unfold. It was a fascinating psychological study in mass delusion. Every single person in my family was performing a role, trying to convince the world and themselves that they were something they were not. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath them had already collapsed. The debt assignment contracts had been fully executed that morning by my contacts in New York. I was currently the sole legal owner of every financial obligation Preston and his parents possessed. I owned their past, their present, and their future. The trap was permanently locked. I was just waiting for the perfect moment to spring it and watch them all fall in. As the evening progressed, the string quartet stopped playing, and the soft murmur of the crowd quieted down. Chloe tapped a silver spoon against her crystal glass, drawing everyone's attention toward the center of the patio. The guests gathered around, forming a wide circle around the happy couple and their beaming parents. My father, Calvin, stepped forward first, delivering a pompous, long-winded speech about family values and the merging of two great dynasties. He spoke about how proud he was of Chloe and how Preston was exactly the caliber of man he had always envisioned for his youngest daughter. He talked about legacy and wealth and the beautiful future stretching out before them. He did not mention my name once. It was as if I did not exist in my own home. But the real spectacle began when Beatrice took the microphone from him. She stepped into the spotlight, her fake diamonds catching the glow of the overhead lanterns. She commanded the space with the practiced ease of a career grifter who knew exactly how to play a room full of wealthy marks. "Thank you, Calvin, for that beautiful introduction." Beatrice began, her voice amplified across the immaculate lawn. "Richard and I are just so thrilled to welcome Chloe into our family. She is a lovely girl, and she has been so incredibly accommodating to our needs. We have all been staying right here in this magnificent home together, and it has been such a wonderful bonding experience for our two families." Beatrice paused, scanning the crowd until her eyes locked directly onto me, standing in the shadows near the catering tent. A malicious smirk spread across her perfectly made-up face. She saw an opportunity to establish her dominance and solidify her fictional status by tearing me down in front of the entire Atlanta elite. "In fact, I want to take a special moment to thank Chloe's older sister Maya Beatrice," announced her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. The crowd turned their heads, following her gaze to where I stood holding my water glass. The collective eyes of local politicians, real estate moguls, and socialites pinned me to the spot. "Maya has been just so remarkably generous." Beatrice continued the condescension, practically oozing from the expensive outdoor speakers. "As you know, Preston and Chloe are deeply in love, and Richard and I needed the proper space to help them plan this magnificent wedding. Maya is such a dedicated spinster that she graciously gave up her large master bedroom so that true love could flourish. She willingly moved her things into the dark basement just to ensure we were comfortable during our stay. It is so rare to find an older unmarried sister who knows her place and steps aside so beautifully for the younger, more successful sibling. Let us all give a round of applause for Maya and her wonderful sacrifice." A smattering of uncomfortable, polite applause rippled through the crowd. Several people cast pitying glances in my direction. They looked at me as if I were a tragic charity case, allowed to exist on the fringes of my vibrant younger sister life. My mother Yvonne stood right next to Beatrice, nodding vigorously in agreement with a wide plastic smile plastered across her face. She was completely validating the public humiliation of her own eldest daughter just to appease a woman who was secretly plotting to steal everything she owned. Chloe leaned her head against Preston's shoulder, giggling softly behind her hand, clearly enjoying every single second of my degradation. Preston flashed a charming smile at the crowd, but his eyes met mine with a cold, calculating challenge. They expected me to shrink away. They expected me to lower my head in shame and retreat back into the basement where they believed I belonged. They thought this public dressing down would break my spirit entirely and solidify their absolute dominance over my house and my life. They thought I was a pathetic, broken woman who would simply absorb the abuse and fade into the background. I looked at Beatrice holding the microphone like a weapon. I looked at my mother nodding like a loyal servant. I looked at Preston wearing a tuxedo bought with stolen retirement funds. The sheer, unadulterated disrespect was the final key turning in the lock. I did not feel humiliated. I did not feel embarrassed or small or defeated. I felt a surge of pure adrenaline course through my veins. I felt the absolute certainty of a predator who has cornered its prey. I slowly placed my glass of sparkling water onto a nearby silver tray. I smoothed down the fabric of my emerald green dress, ensuring every line was perfect. The time for waiting in the shadows was officially over. The time for calculated endurance had passed. I stepped out from this edge of the patio and began walking directly toward the center of the crowd. The guests parted ways, murmuring among themselves as they allowed me to pass through their ranks. I kept my head held high, my posture perfectly straight, and my expression completely unreadable. I did not rush. I walked with the deliberate, measured pace of someone who owns every inch of the ground they are stepping on. Chloe stopped giggling as I approached the center circle. Her eyes widened slightly and she nudged Preston. The triumphant smile on her face began to falter, replaced by a flicker of genuine uncertainty. She had never seen me look this confident before. My father Calvin frowned, taking a step forward as if to physically block my path to the microphone. "Maya, what are you doing?" Calvin hissed under his breath as I drew near, his voice low and threatening. "Go back inside right now. Do not ruin this night for your sister." I ignored him completely, sidestepping his clumsy attempt to intercept me. I did not even grant him the respect of eye contact. I walked straight up to Beatrice, who was still holding the microphone with a confused, bewildered look on her face. She had expected me to run away crying. She had not planned for a confrontation. I reached out and firmly grasped the metal handle of the microphone. Beatrice instinctively tried to pull it back, holding on to it tightly. I did not let go. I fixed her with a look so cold, so absolute, and so utterly devoid of fear that she physically recoiled. Her manicured fingers slipped away from the metal and she stepped backward, bumping into Richard. I turned to face the hundreds of wealthy elite guests standing in my backyard. I tapped the microphone twice, hearing the sharp thud echo through the expensive speaker system. The sound cut through the remaining murmurs in the crowd. The entire estate fell into a dead, breathless silence. Everyone was staring at me, waiting for the humiliated spinster sister to either break down in tears or awkwardly accept the insulting praise. The tension in the humid air was so thick it felt suffocating. I smiled, looking out over the sea of designer dresses and custom suits. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air fill my lungs. The game was finally ending. It was time to introduce the high society of Atlanta to the real Preston family. It was time to show everyone exactly who was sleeping in my master bedroom. And most importantly, it was time to show my parents the absolute devastation of their own catastrophic choices. I brought the microphone to my lips. "Thank you, Beatrice," I began, my voice echoing across the manicured lawn through the expensive outdoor sound system my parents had rented. It was a perfectly polite opening, but the absolute zero temperature of my tone sent a visible shiver through the front row of guests. I looked out over the sea of wealthy socialites, local politicians and business leaders who had gathered in my backyard to celebrate what they thought was the joining of two powerful dynasties. I let the silence stretch for a long moment, holding their attention entirely captive. "You spoke beautifully about sacrifice and family." Beatrice, I continued, pacing slowly across the stone patio. "You spoke about how this house has served as a wonderful bonding space for our two families. But since we are all gathered here tonight under the stars to celebrate the future of Chloe and Preston, I thought it would be appropriate to share a few details about the foundation this relationship is actually built on." I reached into the pocket of my emerald green dress and pulled out a small black remote control. Behind me stood a massive high-definition LED screen that Chloe had explicitly rented for this exact moment in the evening. She had planned to show a touching romantic montage of her and Preston traveling, having expensive dinners, and acting like the perfect high society couple. I pointed the remote at the projection unit and pressed the main button. The massive screen flickered to life, illuminating the entire backyard with a bright, glaring white light. But there was no romantic music, and there were no photos of happy couples. Instead, a highly magnified, crystal-clear image of a crumpled pawnshop receipt filled the screen. The logo of a cheap strip mall discount jewelry broker was prominently displayed at the top right, next to a date stamp from exactly 3 weeks ago. The guests murmured in confusion, leaning forward to read the massive text. I turned to look directly at my sister, who was suddenly clutching her left hand against her chest. "Chloe," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the confused whispers of the crowd, "you have spent the entire evening showing off that massive 3-carat flawless diamond ring. You told everyone it was a precious family heirloom passed down through generations of the aristocratic Preston family. You told the mayor wife that it was completely priceless." I pressed the button again, and the screen transitioned to a certified gemologist appraisal document, accompanied by a close-up photograph of the exact ring currently sitting on my sister finger. But according to this official appraisal report generated by the discount pawn shop that sold it to your fiancé, the stone is actually industrial-grade cubic zirconia, set in a cheap nickel alloy band, I explained. The total retail value of your generational family heirloom is exactly $450. Chloe's face lost all its color in a single instant. She looked down at her hand, staring at the cloudy fake rock, as if it had suddenly turned into a venomous spider. She frantically tried to cover her hand with her other arm, looking around at the wealthy guests who were now openly staring at her and whispering behind their hands. The illusion of her fairy tale romance was shattering in real time, right in front of the people she most wanted to impress. But a $400 fake ring is just a petty lie. I continued, my voice rising slightly to cut through the growing commotion. The real tragedy is how Preston actually paid for it. I clicked the remote a third time. The screen flashed and split into two separate images. On the left side was a highlighted bank statement. On the right side was a maxed-out credit card bill. Both documents prominently displayed the legal name of my mother, Yvonne. I turned my gaze to my parents, who were standing near the front of the crowd. My mother looked as though the ground had simply vanished beneath her feet. She was shaking her eyes wide with unadulterated terror as she stared at her own private financial ruin, broadcast 20 feet high in her eldest daughter's backyard. You see, Preston did not just buy a cheap fake ring, I told the captivated audience. He convinced my parents to sign a comprehensive power of attorney over their entire estate. He told them he was a brilliant investment banker who was going to double their retirement savings so they could afford to throw this massive, lavish party. But Preston is not an investment banker. I took every single dime my mother and father had left in the world, and he transferred it directly into his own personal accounts. He used my mother's credit cards to buy that cheap fake ring for Chloe, and he used my father's retirement fund to pay for the tuxedo he is wearing right now. The collective gasp from the Atlanta elite was deafening. The city councilman, who had been laughing with Beatrice just minutes earlier, literally took 2 steps away from her, as if poverty and fraud were contagious diseases. My father, Calvin, looked like he was having a heart attack. He clutched his chest, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple, as the reality of his complete financial annihilation was laid bare before his precious country club friends. He had spent his entire life projecting an image of untouchable black wealth, and now everyone in the city knew he was completely broke and had been easily scammed by a man half his age. Preston's handsome, charming facade completely dissolved. The smug superiority that had defined his entire existence in my house vanished, replaced by the frantic, desperate energy of a cornered animal. His face turned bright red, the veins in his neck bulging against his stolen tuxedo collar. He realized that I had not just found out about his grift, I had meticulously weaponized the information to destroy him in front of the most powerful people in the state. "Shut up," Preston roared, abandoning his fake, refined accent entirely. His voice was harsh and guttural, echoing violently across the patio. "Shut your mouth right now, you lying crazy woman." He lunged forward, charging across the stone patio with his hands curled into tight fists. He intended to physically rip the microphone out of my hands and smash the remote control to stop the presentation. The guests screamed and scattered out of his way, terrified of his sudden explosive aggression. My father actually took a step backward, refusing to protect me. But I did not move. I did not flinch or step away. I stood my ground, staring him down with absolute predatory calm. Just as he closed the final few feet between us, 2 of my massive tactical security guards stepped out from the shadows of the catering tent. They moved with terrifying speed, stepping directly into Preston's path and crossing their heavy arms over their tactical vests. Preston slammed into them, bouncing off their solid frames like a child hitting a brick wall. He stumbled backward, panting heavily, glaring at me with eyes full of pure hatred. I gave the security guards a small nod of gratitude and turned back to the crowd, perfectly composed. I raised the microphone again, ignoring the man who was currently being restrained just a few feet away from me. "It seems the groom is a little upset that we are discussing his finances," I said, my voice completely steady. "So let us talk about his corporate background instead. He has spent the last 2 weeks telling everyone here about his family's massive transportation empire. Let us see how business is really going." I pressed the button on the remote again. The screen behind me transitioned from my mother bank statements to a stark black and white legal document bearing the official seal of the Federal Bankruptcy Court of Delaware. The name Preston Holdings LLC was highlighted in bright yellow ink right above a massive red stamp that read, Chapter 7 Liquidation. "This is the official federal bankruptcy filing for the Great Preston Empire from late 2022, I announced. Preston and his parents do not have old money. They do not have summer homes in Europe. They do not have a transportation company. What they have is a multi-million-dollar trail of unpaid debts, defrauded small business owners, and ruined lives. They are professional parasites who travel the country looking for families desperate enough for social validation that they will hand over the keys to their bank accounts without running a single background check. Beatrice let out a high-pitched wailing sound, covering her face with her hands. Richard spun around, frantically looking for a way out of the backyard, but my security team had already quietly moved to block every single exit gate. The wealthy guests who had been sipping champagne with them just moments before were now openly glaring at them, pulling out their expensive smartphones to take pictures and record the absolute destruction of the grifters who had tried to infiltrate their circle. But bankruptcy is not even the most interesting part of their portfolio. I continued, determined to finish the complete execution of their false identities. I clicked the remote one final time. The screen shifted to a completely different set of legal documents. These were not financial ledgers. These were official police records complete with booking photos and state seals. The gasps from the audience grew even louder as they stared at the glaring bold text at the top of the documents. Active arrest warrants, I read aloud, ensuring my voice carried to the very back of the estate lawn. Preston currently has active warrants in the states of Florida and Texas for felony wire fraud and grand theft. And Richard and Beatrice, those are not even their real names. They have operated under at least 4 different aliases in the past decade, targeting minority families with new wealth. They isolate the favorite child, charm the parents, drain the retirement funds, and vanish into the night before anyone realizes the accounts are empty. Chloe dropped to her knees on the stone patio, sobbing hysterically. Her pristine, beaded designer gown pooled around her in a pathetic heap. She was hyperventilating, clutching her chest as the fairy tale she had weaponized against me burned to the ground. She had built her entire online persona around catching a wealthy, aristocratic white man, and she had just been exposed as the ultimate gullible mark who had helped a wanted fugitive steal her own parents' life savings. My mother, Yvonne, fell to the ground right next to her golden child, weeping so loudly it echoed over the music speakers. She was mourning the loss of her money, the loss of her precious social standing, and the absolute total humiliation of being proven so spectacularly wrong in front of her country club peers. She looked up at me, her makeup running down her face in dark streaks, silently pleading with me to make it stop, to turn off the screen, to save whatever tiny shred of dignity they had left. But I had no mercy left to give. They had traded my dignity for a chance to impress these criminals. They had tried to banish me to a basement in my own home. They had enabled my abuse for 32 years. I looked down at my mother crying on the stones, and I felt absolutely nothing but the cool, satisfying breeze of justice taking its natural course. I turned my attention back to Preston, who was still breathing heavily while being boxed in by my security team. His eyes darted around the enclosed patio, realizing there was no way out. The elite guests were murmuring angrily, pointing at him and demanding that someone call the authorities. He had thought he was the smartest person in the room, manipulating a family of status-obsessed fools. He had severely underestimated the quiet sister who watched everything from the shadows. "You wanted to play games with property rights?" Preston, I asked, looking directly into his panicked eyes. "You wanted to sit in my kitchen and threaten me with civil court procedures. You thought you could use the law as a shield to bleed us dry." I smiled, and it was a terrible, cold expression. "Well, let us see how well you navigate the law when the Financial Crimes Division gets here. They have been very eager to find you, and I was more than happy to provide them with your current mailing address." The distant wail of police sirens cut through the heavy silence of the backyard. The sound grew louder and more piercing with every passing second, until the flashing red and blue lights began to reflect off the pristine white floral archways my parents had so foolishly purchased. The elite guests of Atlanta parted like the Red Sea as 6 plainclothes detectives and several uniformed officers marched straight onto the stone patio. They did not care about the expensive landscaping or the delicate crystal champagne tower they brushed past. They moved with absolute lethal purpose directly toward the man sweating in his stolen tuxedo. The lead detective flashed a gold badge and loudly called out the legal name of Preston, which was not actually Preston, but a completely different alias he had been hiding behind for years. The detective recited the active warrants for felony wire fraud and grand theft across multiple state lines. Preston tried to struggle. He tried to put his hands up and claim it was a massive misunderstanding. He looked at the wealthy guests surrounding him, trying to maintain his fake aristocratic persona, but the officers were not interested in his lies. They spun him around, roughly shoving him face first against one of the tall stone pillars that held up the terrace awning. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing across the manicured lawn was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The charming fake aristocrat was completely reduced to a pathetic whimpering criminal as they dragged him away from the champagne tower, and Frog marched him toward the waiting squad cars parked in my long circular driveway. The police officers meticulously detailed the exact nature of the crimes, ensuring that every wealthy guest in attendance understood the precise level of fraud Preston had committed. The local politicians who had shaken his hand earlier were now actively speaking with the detectives, providing statements to distance themselves from the scandal. Preston begged his mother for help, but Beatrice was too busy cowering behind a floral arrangement to even look at her son. Chloe completely lost her grip on reality, watching her fabricated fairy tale shatter into a million pieces. She scrambled across the stone patio on her hands and knees, her expensive beaded designer dress tearing against the rough surface. She reached out toward the officers, sobbing uncontrollably and begging them to stop. When the police completely ignored her frantic pleas, she slowly turned her head and locked her tear-stained eyes on me. She scrambled up from the ground and charged at me, her hands curled into claws ready to strike. My tactical security guards immediately stepped forward to intercept her, but I raised my hand and waved them off. I wanted her to speak. I wanted everyone to witness the absolute depth of her delusion. "You ruined my life," Chloe screamed, her face contorted with irrational, terrifying rage. "You planned this whole thing just to destroy my happiness, because you are a bitter, lonely spinster who cannot stand to see anyone else in love. He loved me, and you took him away from me. You are a jealous monster, Maya, and I will never forgive you for this." I looked at the spoiled sister, who had happily ordered me to live in a damp basement just 24 hours prior. I felt absolutely no pity for the woman screaming in my face. "You fell in love with a delusion, Chloe," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any sympathy. "He did not love you. He loved the retirement funds Mom and Dad blindly handed over to him. He was planning to leave you the exact moment those bank accounts ran dry. I did not ruin your life. I simply gave you a front row seat to the natural consequences of your own terrible choices. You built your entire identity around capturing a wealthy white man, and you were so desperate for validation that you ignored every single red flag." My mother Yvonne let out a horrifying wail that sounded like a wounded animal taking its final breath. She was rocking back and forth on the patio stones, clutching her stomach as if she had been physically disemboweled. The absolute reality of her financial ruin was finally breaking through her thick layer of denial. All the money was gone. The retirement savings, the emergency funds, the home equity, everything they had built over 30 years of working had been liquidated to buy fake diamonds and fund a criminal defense strategy for a man who was now sitting in the back of a police cruiser. She looked at her country club friends who were staring at her with open disgust, and she knew she would never show her face in polite society again. Her reputation was permanently destroyed. My father Calvin was leaning heavily against a catering table, grasping his chest and gasping for air. He looked at the wealthy politicians and real estate moguls who were whispering and pointing at him. His entire identity was built on projecting superiority and flawless generational wealth. He had spent his life treating me like a disappointment because I chose a quiet corporate career over flashy social climbing. Now he was nothing but a gullible, broke old man who had essentially financed a con artist. The humiliation was breaking his mind. "We have nothing left," Calvin muttered, his voice hollow and broken, as he stared at the empty space where Preston had been standing. "We are completely ruined, and we have absolutely nothing to our names." But the theatrical performance of the evening was not entirely over. While Beatrice was weeping silently into her hands and mourning the loss of their greatest mark, Richard decided he still had one last desperate card to play. He was a career criminal who was used to slipping out of tight corners, and he refused to accept that a black woman he viewed as inferior had completely outsmarted him. He stepped forward, his face red with defiance, pointing a thick, aggressive finger at me. "You think you have won?" Richard barked, his voice laced with pure venom. "You think you can just hand my son over to the police and kick us to the curb like common trash? Well, you forgot one very important detail about how the law works, little girl." He gestured broadly around the massive estate, his eyes scanning the remaining security guards. "We are still legally residents of this property," Richard announced, a smug, arrogant smile fighting its way back onto his face. "I do not care if you own the corporate fund that holds the deed to this house. The police cannot physically remove us tonight, and you know it. The officers just told us themselves that tenancy disputes are a civil matter, and they cannot intervene without a court order. We have the mail, we have the front door key, and we have the legal constitutional right to sleep in that master bedroom upstairs. We are not leaving this house, Maya. If you want us out, you are going to have to file a formal eviction notice and drag us through the slow court system for the next 8 months. We are going to make your life an absolute living hell, and we are going to enjoy every single second of it." I looked at the man who had ground his cheap, pungent cigars into my historic hardwood floors and treated me like a hired servant in my own home. He really believed the legal system was his personal impenetrable shield. He truly thought his basic knowledge of squatter rights made him completely untouchable. I let out a slow, deep, melodic laugh that echoed across the quiet patio, causing his smug smile to falter slightly. I turned to my heavy leather briefcase resting on a nearby catering table. I opened the brass clasps and pulled out a thick, bound portfolio that I had received from my private equity contacts in New York that very morning. I did not hand the portfolio to him politely. I threw the heavy, thick binder directly at his chest. It hit him hard enough to make him stumble backward before the binder fell to the stone patio, scattering several official watermarked documents across the ground at his feet. Richard stared at the papers and then looked back at me, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. "Pick it up, Richard," I commanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "Read the terms of your new reality." He slowly bent down and picked up the top document. His eyes scanned the legal jargon and the color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. His hands began to shake violently, causing the heavy paper to rattle in the quiet night air. "What is this?" he mumbled, his arrogant tone completely vanishing. "This is a master assignment of debt." "It is your entire life," I explained, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "Yesterday morning, my private equity firm reached out to the secondary distressed debt markets. We found the massive portfolio of defaulted loans, civil judgments, and unpaid restitution orders that your family has racked up over the past decade. We found every single person you defrauded, every small vendor you stiffed, every victim who sued you and won, but never saw a single dime because you hid behind shell companies and fake bankruptcy filings. The original creditors were desperate to get anything back, so they sold the toxic debt for pennies on the dollar." I smiled, watching his eyes widen in pure, unadulterated terror as the realization set in. "I bought it, Richard," I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "I bought every single financial obligation you and Beatrice possess. The total value is just over $2 million. I am not just the owner of this beautiful house. I am your sole legal creditor. I own your debt, which means I essentially own you." "You want to talk about manipulating the legal system?" I continued, stepping even closer so he could see the absolute lack of mercy in my eyes. "Let us talk about what a highly motivated corporate creditor can do to a helpless debtor. You want to stay in my house for 6 months fighting an eviction order. Go right ahead, take your time, because tomorrow morning I will immediately file motions to garnish any wages you ever earn. I will place legal liens on any vehicle you ever attempt to drive. I will freeze any bank account you ever attempt to open anywhere in the world. I have an entire corporate legal department that will dedicate their working hours to making sure you never experience a single moment of financial peace for the rest of your miserable lives. You will not be able to buy a cup of coffee without my lawyers knowing about it and seizing the funds." The fear in Richard's eyes was intoxicating. I watched as the complex legal reality crushed the last remaining ounces of his pride. He looked at his wife Beatrice, who was currently weeping tears of genuine despair, her fake cubic zirconia necklace looking incredibly pathetic under the harsh glare of the patio lights. You thought you could come into my city, into my home, and treat me like an ignorant pawn, I said, my voice echoing across the silent yard. You thought your proximity to whiteness and your fake aristocratic accent gave you an automatic advantage over a black woman who chose to observe rather than speak. You severely underestimated my intelligence, and you completely misunderstood the sheer volume of resources I control. I pointed at the scattered documents on the patio floor. Pick up your new debt portfolio, Richard, I ordered. Take it upstairs to the master bedroom you stole from me. Read every single page of it tonight while you try to sleep. Calculate the compounding interest I am legally allowed to charge you under the terms of the original loan agreements. You will quickly realize that even if you lived for another 100 years, you could never earn enough money to pay me back. You are permanently shackled to me, and I will never let you go. Richard dropped the document as if it had physically burned his fingers. His arrogant bluster completely evaporated, replaced by the stark, horrific realization that he had picked a fight with a predator infinitely higher on the food chain. He had spent his entire life playing pathetic games with small, vulnerable families, and he had accidentally walked straight into the crushing jaws of a corporate titan. Beatrice let out a low, whimpering sound collapsing against a stone pillar, completely broken. They were trapped. They had absolutely no money, no son to protect them, and an adversary who held the power to destroy them entirely. They were at my absolute mercy, and they knew I had none left to give. Richard stared at this debt portfolio scattered across the stone patio. His entire body trembled as the crushing reality of his situation set in. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and completely stripped of their former arrogance. But the delusion of a career grifter is a stubborn disease. He clenched his jaw and tried to summon one last pathetic attempt at defiance. He pointed a shaking finger at me and let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "You can buy my debt." Maya Richard spat, his voice echoing across the silent backyard. "You can freeze my accounts and you can garnish my wages for the rest of my life. But the law is still the law. You are the landlord and we are the legal tenants of this property. We have established residency in this historic mansion and we are not leaving. You still have to take us to civil court for a formal eviction order. We will stay right here sleeping in the master bedroom while you waste months fighting us in front of a judge." I shook my head slowly, letting out a soft, melodic sigh of genuine amusement. It was honestly impressive how tightly he clung to his squatter rights playbook. I looked at my parents, Yvonne and Calvin, who were clutching each other near the catering tent. Their faces were pale masks of sheer absolute terror. They were staring at their beloved historic estate, the physical manifestation of their carefully curated social status, realizing that it was currently occupied by hostile parasites who refused to leave. I stepped back from Richard and addressed my parents directly. I deliberately elevated my voice so every single local politician and real estate developer remaining in the backyard could hear the final act of this tragedy. "You know, Mom and Dad," I said, my tone conversational and light. "I have to admit that Richard is absolutely correct about the complexities of tenancy law in the state of Georgia. It is incredibly difficult for a landlord to quickly remove established squatters from a residential property. The civil courts are backed up for months, and the legal fees associated with a forced eviction are exorbitant. It is a massive headache that I honestly had absolutely zero interest in dealing with." Yvonne looked at me, her tear-stained face contorting in deep confusion. "What are you saying, Maya?" "Maya," she whimpered, her voice barely audible over the soft rustle of the evening breeze. "Are you just going to let them stay here? Are you going to let these criminals live in our family home?" I smiled a smile so incredibly cold it could have frozen the water in the decorative reflecting pools. "I would never let them stay in my home," I corrected her, gently emphasizing the word "my." "But I also have absolutely no intention of filing an eviction notice. You see, I do not need to evict anyone because I am no longer the landlord of this property." The collective gasp from the elite crowd was immediate and deafening. Calvin stepped forward, his eyes wide with a new kind of rising panic. "What do you mean you are no longer the landlord?" he demanded, his voice cracking with fear. "You just told us you bought the house 5 years ago to save us from the bank." "I did buy it 5 years ago, Dad," I confirmed, nodding my head slowly. "And it was a fantastic financial investment. The property values in Cascade Heights have skyrocketed over the past few years, But as a successful director of a commercial real estate trust, I know exactly when it is time to liquidate an asset for maximum profit. 30 days ago, while you and Mom were desperately throwing your retirement savings at a fake aristocrat to fund a lavish wedding, I quietly placed this entire estate on the private commercial market, and I am thrilled to announce that it sold immediately. I sold the mansion's grounds, and every single inch of this property, to a massive commercial development group, I explained, watching the absolute horror spread across my father's face. They are a highly aggressive firm from out of state that specializes in high-density urban redevelopment. They paid me a massive premium in cash because this specific lot is perfectly zoned for a large luxury condominium complex. The transaction officially closed and recorded 3 days ago. I do not own this house anymore. Richard dropped his arms to his sides, his jaw hitting the floor. The remaining color drained from his face as he realized his squatter rights were suddenly completely useless. Squatter rights only apply when you are fighting a residential landlord looking to preserve the property. They mean absolutely nothing when the property itself is slated for total destruction. I turned back to Richard, checking my expensive watch with practiced indifference. The new commercial development group is not interested in playing civil court games with professional parasites, I told him, my voice ringing with absolute finality. They do not care about your forwarded mail or your fake residential lease agreements. They only care about clearing the lot to break ground on their new, highly profitable luxury project. I reached into my leather briefcase one last time and pulled out a single sheet of heavy legal paper bearing the official bright red stamp of the City Zoning Commission. I held it up high for everyone in the backyard to see. These are the approved and active demolition permits, I announced, the words cutting through the humid night air like a scythe. The new owners have already contacted the city to disconnect the main utility lines. The running water and the electricity will be officially shut off in exactly 4 hours. And at exactly 6 in the morning tomorrow, a fleet of heavy industrial bulldozers will roll through those wrought iron gates and flatten this entire historic mansion into a pile of crushed brick and splintered wood. The absolute devastation that swept through my family was biblical. My mother Yvonne let out a blood-curdling scream and collapsed entirely. Her knees hit the hard stone patio with a sickening thud. She threw her arms around my legs, burying her face in the fabric of my emerald green dress. She began sobbing with a desperation that was painful to witness. Her entire identity was tied to the walls of that brick mansion, and now she was watching it burn to the ground. "No, Maya, please no," Yvonne wailed, her voice hoarse and broken. "You cannot let them destroy the house. This is our legacy. This is our family history. We have lived here for 30 years. You cannot let them tear it down. Please, Maya, I am begging you. Buy it back. You have the money. You have the power. Stop the bulldozers. I will do anything you want. I will get on my hands and knees and scrub the floors for you. Just please do not let them destroy our beautiful home." My father, Calvin, a man who had spent his entire life projecting an image of untouchable pride and stubborn arrogance, actually dropped to his knees right beside my mother. His expensive suit pants absorbed the spilled champagne on the patio, but he did not care. Tears streamed down his weathered face as he looked up at me with total, utter defeat. He finally realized the catastrophic cost of his actions. "Maya, please," Calvin begged, his hands shaking as he reached out toward me. "I am sorry. I am so incredibly sorry for everything. I was a terrible father. I treated you poorly. I was blinded by my own ego and my own foolish pride. But this house is everything we have left in the world. It is the only thing that proves we were here. It is our entire kingdom. You cannot erase our legacy. Please save the house." Chloe was still sitting on the ground nearby, her ruined designer dress wrapped around her trembling body. She was completely silent, staring at the massive brick mansion that she had intended to rule over as a high society wife. The realization that she would be waking up homeless with absolutely nothing to her name had completely broken her mind. The fairy tale was over, and the brutal reality of poverty was staring her right in the face. I looked down at my parents groveling at my feet, begging me to save the physical manifestation of their fake status. I felt absolutely no guilt. I felt no urge to comfort them or lift them up from the stone patio. The well of my empathy had run completely dry years ago, drained by their constant cruelty and their blatant favoritism. They had spent my entire life making me feel small, and now they were the ones begging for mercy. I slowly stepped back, forcing my mother to release her desperate grip on my dress. I looked at the two people who had given me life and felt nothing but cold, clinical detachment. You talk about legacy. I said, my voice soft, but echoing with terrible clarity. You beg me to save your family history, but you did not care about your legacy when you secretly mortgaged this house to fund a doomed vanity project for your favorite daughter. You did not care about family history when you blindly handed over your entire life savings to a white man you barely knew just because he promised you access to elite circles. You destroyed your own legacy, I told them, delivering the absolute truth without a single ounce of mercy. You chose status over substance. You chose an illusion over your own flesh and blood. You were perfectly willing to throw your eldest daughter into a damp basement and erase my existence in this house just to impress a family of criminals. You sacrificed everything real in your life for a fake diamond ring and a fraudulent tuxedo. I turned my back on their weeping figures and walked over to the patio edge where I had left my sleek black overnight bag. I grasped the leather handle, feeling the reassuring weight of my absolute independence. I looked back at the crowd of elite guests who were watching the scene in stunned, captivated silence. They had come to celebrate a high society wedding, and instead they had witnessed the total annihilation of the Cascade Heights dynasty. The rumors and gossip from this night would echo through the elite circles of Atlanta for decades. I looked at Richard and Beatrice, who were staring at the towering brick mansion, realizing that their squatter paradise was about to become a literal construction zone. I looked at my parents still weeping on the stone patio, mourning a house they had actually lost 5 years ago. I did not offer them any comfort. I did not offer them a place to stay. They were adults who had made their choices, and now they had to live with the severe consequences. My security team stepped forward, forming a protective wedge around me as I walked toward the driveway where a sleek black town car was already waiting with the engine running. I paused at the edge of the patio, looking back at the wreckage of my biological family one last time. The air was thick with the smell of expensive catering and impending doom. I smiled, feeling the cool night breeze against my face. The demolition crews are very punctual, I warned them, my voice ringing out across the silent yard for the final time. You have less than 10 hours to pack whatever dignity you have left and vacate the premises. I suggest you start moving now before the water gets shut off. I turned toward the waiting car, opening the heavy door. Sleep well in the rubble, I said. I slid into the leather seat of the town car and closed the door. The driver immediately pulled away from the estate, gliding smoothly down the long driveway and out through the heavy wrought iron gates. I watched the mansion disappear in the rearview mirror, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over my soul. The burden of my toxic family was finally gone. I was driving into a bright, limitless future, and I was leaving them exactly where they belonged, entirely in the past. The hours between my departure and the dawn passed with the relentless precision of a ticking clock. I did not sleep. I sat in the plush leather seat of my corporate office downtown, watching the live security feed from the perimeter cameras I had installed around the estate weeks ago. The digital timestamp on the bottom corner of the monitor glowed bright red in the dark room. It was 5:45 in the morning. The humid Atlanta air was thick with morning mist, but the street outside the grand wrought iron gates was already buzzing with frantic energy. I had made a few anonymous calls to local news stations during the night, tipping them off about a massive financial scandal involving prominent socialites and a dramatic early morning demolition. The local press corps never missed an opportunity to broadcast the spectacular downfall of the wealthy elite. 4 news vans were parked haphazardly along the street, their bright satellite dishes raised toward the gray morning sky. Reporters stood on the damp grass adjusting their microphones and practicing their serious, somber expressions for the morning broadcast. They were completely ready to capture the total annihilation of the Cascade Heights dynasty. At exactly 6 in the morning, the heavy rumbling sound of massive industrial diesel engines echoed down the quiet suburban street. A convoy of yellow bulldozers and heavy excavators rolled toward the property line, their metal treads grinding harshly against the asphalt. The sheer size of the machinery was terrifying. The development group I sold the property to was not wasting a single second. They wanted the lot cleared by noon, and they had brought enough heavy equipment to flatten a small city. The lead foreman approached the locked gates holding a thick clipboard containing the approved city demolition permits. He did not bother ringing the intercom. He simply signaled to a worker holding heavy metal cutters who snapped the thick chains securing the gates. The iron doors swung open with a loud metallic screech, inviting the mechanical beasts onto the pristine manicured lawns. Inside the mansion, absolute panic had finally taken control. As the massive yellow bulldozers crossed the property line and blared their deafening air horns, signaling the immediate commencement of the demolition, the front doors of the historic brownstone flew open. The chaotic, disgraceful exodus began. It was a scene of pure, unadulterated humiliation broadcast live across local television networks for the entire city to witness. Richard and Beatrice, the career grifters, who had planned to live out their days in stolen luxury, were the first to flee. They stumbled out onto the front porch wearing wrinkled silk pajamas, clutching black plastic garbage bags filled with whatever random items they could steal in the dark. Beatrice was weeping uncontrollably, her fake cubic zirconia jewelry abandoned somewhere in the master bedroom. Richard looked like a terrified rat scurrying down the stone steps, tripping over his own feet as the shadow of a massive excavator fell over the driveway. They ran straight past the news cameras trying to hide their faces, but the bright camera flashes captured their utter disgrace permanently. My mother Yvonne and my father Calvin followed closely behind them. The proud, arrogant patriarch and the status-obsessed matriarch were completely reduced to panicked refugees fleeing a collapsing kingdom. Calvin was carrying a single cardboard box containing a few suits and a framed country club membership certificate that was now absolutely worthless. His face was a mask of sheer agony as the reality of his homelessness set in. He looked at the news cameras and immediately tried to cover his face with his free hand, a pathetic attempt to hide his ruin from his wealthy friends who were definitely watching the morning news. Yvonne was sobbing so loudly she could barely breathe. Her carefully styled hair was a messy, tangled bird nest, and she was wearing mismatched slippers. She stopped on the front lawn, dropping her trash bags onto the wet grass, and fell to her knees weeping as the first bulldozer drove its massive metal bucket straight through the beautiful antique front doors of the estate. The splintering crash of the heavy mahogany doors was the final death knell of their fabricated legacy. Chloe was the last to emerge. The golden child, the pampered princess, who had demanded I move into a damp basement, was dragging a broken designer suitcase behind her. She was wearing the exact same ruined beaded gown from the engagement party, the delicate fabric now torn and stained with dirt and spilled champagne. She looked completely deranged, her mascara smeared down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. She screamed at the construction workers, begging them to stop, but her voice was completely drowned out by the roaring diesel engines and the sound of crushing brick. The local reporters shoved microphones toward her, asking how it felt to finance a fugitive criminal with her parents' retirement funds. Chloe simply collapsed onto the driveway, curling into a fetal position as the heavy machinery tore through the roof of the grand mansion, sending massive clouds of dust and debris high into the morning sky. I watched the entire spectacle from the quiet safety of my office, my face completely devoid of any emotion. The demolition was swift and brutal. Within 2 hours, the sprawling historic estate was nothing but a massive pile of shattered wood and broken bricks. The kingdom was gone. Preston was sitting in a holding cell at the county jail, waiting for federal agents to transport him to Florida to face multiple felony charges for wire fraud. He would eventually be sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, his aristocratic facade traded for a bright orange jumpsuit. Richard and Beatrice were left wandering the streets of Atlanta completely homeless and drowning in the $2 million debt portfolio I legally owned. My corporate lawyers immediately froze every single asset they tried to hide and garnished the few dollars they managed to scrape together. They were permanently trapped in a cycle of crushing poverty, working dead-end cash jobs just to survive while my firm legally extracted every single penny they earned. They had tried to bleed me dry, and I had turned them into my permanent financial slaves. 6 months passed, transforming the humid Georgia summer into a crisp, beautiful autumn. The passage of time did not heal the wounds of my biological family, it only deepened their self-inflicted misery. Yvonne and Calvin, having lost their home, their retirement, and their entire social standing, were forced to move into a tiny, cramped apartment in a dangerous neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. They were drowning in debt and physically exhausted from the brutal reality of the working class. Calvin, the man who used to boast about his executive status, was now working the overnight shift at a local hardware store, sweeping floors and stocking shelves for minimum wage. His back ached constantly, and his pride was entirely shattered every time a rude customer demanded his help. Yvonne, the woman who obsessed over designer clothes and country club luncheons, spent her days working as a cashier at a discount grocery store, bagging cheap food for people she used to openly mock. She spent her shifts wearing an ugly polyester uniform, praying she would not run into anyone from her former elite social circles. Chloe fared no better. Her social media empire completely imploded the moment her followers realized her entire lifestyle was funded by a criminal fraud scheme. Brands dropped her sponsorships, people reported her accounts, and the internet tore her reputation to shreds. Without our parents to pay her bills and fund her delusions, she was forced to face the real world with absolutely no marketable skills. The former golden child was now working long, grueling shifts as a waitress at a cheap diner, constantly getting yelled at by angry customers while smelling like stale grease. The fake diamond ring she loved so much had been pawned to pay for her first month of rent in a miserable roach-infested studio apartment. She spent her nights crying into a thin pillow, mourning the fairy tale that never actually existed. Despite everything, they still tried to reach out. My phone would occasionally light up with desperate, pathetic text messages from unrecognized numbers. They were always variations of the same manipulative garbage they used to spew. Please, we are struggling so much. One message from my mother read. We have learned our lesson. We miss our daughter. Please just send a little money to help us buy groceries. We love you. Another message from Chloe arrived a week later, begging for a second chance. I am so sorry for how I treated you, Maya. I was blinded by love. I am working so hard now, but I cannot pay my electricity bill. You are so rich now, can you please just help your little sister? I never responded. I never engaged. I simply pressed the delete button, watching their desperate pleas vanish into the digital void. They were no longer my problem. They were strangers dealing with the natural consequences of their own horrific actions. I stood on the expansive glass balcony of my new penthouse in the heart of Buckhead, the cool autumn breeze gently rustling the fabric of my tailored silk evening gown. The city of Atlanta stretched out beneath me, a glittering ocean of bright lights and endless possibilities. I had purchased this penthouse entirely in cash, a testament to the incredible success of my commercial real estate fund. The business had grown exponentially over the past 6 months, and I was now widely recognized as one of the most powerful corporate directors in the Southeast. I had built an absolute empire from the ground up, using my own intelligence, my own determination, and my own unwavering strength. Behind me, the warm, ambient light of my massive living room spilled out onto the terrace. I turned my head slightly, listening to the wonderful sounds of genuine laughter and joyful conversation drifting through the open glass doors. I was hosting a private dinner party to celebrate the closing of our latest acquisition. But the people sitting around my custom dining table were not blood relatives. They were my chosen family. There were brilliant corporate attorneys, fierce financial analysts, and loyal friends who had stood by my side during the darkest moments of my life. There was Marcus, the private investigator, who had helped me expose the grifters, now a trusted security consultant for my firm. There were people who respected my mind, who valued my time, and who treated me with the absolute dignity I deserved. There was no gaslighting, no manipulation, and no conditional love. There was only mutual respect and authentic connection. I turned back to look at the glittering city skyline, feeling a profound, deep sense of absolute peace settle over my soul. The heavy toxic chains that had bound me to Yvonne, Calvin, and Chloe for 32 years were permanently shattered. I had spent my entire life trying to earn a place in a family that was determined to keep me in the basement. I had finally realized that I did not need to beg for a seat at their table because I was perfectly capable of buying the entire building and building my own table. I raised my crystal glass of vintage wine, holding it up toward the starry night sky. I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the rich, complex flavor of my hard-earned victory. The wine tasted like power. It tasted like justice. But most importantly, it tasted like pure, unadulterated freedom. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath of the crisp night air, completely untethered, completely untouchable, and completely free from the toxic bloodline that had tried to destroy me. The most profound takeaway from this story is that biological ties do not obligate you to endure disrespect or exploitation. When a family consistently diminishes your worth and prioritizes their own status over your well-being, walking away isn't an act of betrayal, it is the ultimate act of self-preservation. Maya's journey teaches us that true power comes from silent preparation, financial independence, and ironclad boundaries. You never have to fight for a seat at a toxic table. Instead, you can build your own empire. Define your own success and surround yourself with a chosen family built on genuine mutual respect. If Maya's journey resonated with you, share this story with someone who needs a reminder to stand in their own power and cut ties with toxicity.